The following is the chapter, Competitive Dispute Resolution, taken from the coming audiobook. The Free Isles Project. An early 1960s exploration into seasteading, alternative dispute resolution, and voluntary governance. Narrated by yours truly, Brian Freer-Robot. This excerpt, including the full suite of documents from the early, innovative Free Isles project, are definitely worth a listen or a read. And maybe, just maybe, some of these radical ideas could be reappropriated for the Free Republic of P.A.Z.NIA. Who knows? To support further productions like this, please consider checking out our full catalog of books, audiobooks, privacy tools, health and wellness items, and more by visiting libertyunderattack.com. Again, libertyunderattack.com. Competitive Dispute Resolution. Gill 1163. Preform Confidential. What is the concept I propose? By way of introduction, I recommend the editorials which appeared in the Santa Ana Register, January 12, 1962, entitled Democracy with a Small d and Majority Becomes Monopoly Control. Reprints of this editorial are available from the CCI bookshelf. Government does not exist in nature. It was not discovered. It was invented by man and exists only in the mind of man. It is a concept and nothing more. As such, there is nothing immutable about its nature. It is a tool designed to do a job. That job is the protection of property, and I use Golombo's definition of property: man's life, his freedom, and the fruits of that life. The protection of property is a very important job, which must be adequately accomplished, but government as we know it today is not necessarily the only tool fitted to the task. In fact, I contend it is a very inferior tool. Let's examine briefly the basic nature of government as it exists today. Primitive man and the tree ape before him lived in tribes. Their nature was such that individually they could not survive, but collectively they could dominate a position on the ecology. Within the collective, differences between individuals were evident. Some individuals had more muscles or better skills with weapons. The strongest declared himself to be tribal chief. He seized whatever property he desired by virtue of his strength, and he extended his dominion over anyone and everyone within reach of his physical strength. This seemed to those of the tribe to be the natural order of things. One had four choices: continue to live under the current chief, leave one's home and friends, etc., and journey to another tribe to live under their chief, go off and attempt to survive alone, or begin a secret muscle building course and eventually become chief oneself. To primitive man it seemed natural that if one had muscles one used them on all within reach. At a further stage of development, feudal barons had vastly improved the technology of force. The muscled individual was replaced by the small organized army, the horse, the sword, and the bow, but to the baron it also seemed perfectly natural that if one had an army one used it to the limit of effectivity. Consequently, the boundaries of baronies are geographical barriers which rendered further invasion difficult and uneconomical. Gradually barons discovered that a man given more freedom would produce more for himself and more for the baron. Gradually slave holders discovered that a slave leased to himself would earn more for his owner than a slave with little freedom. Gradually the actions of those who called themselves government were limited. The Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, but never has a government been erected which did not include the concept of the collective. That all persons within this geographical area must belong to this government. Every government that has ever existed has claimed a franchise. That is, an exclusive right to be the one and only government in that area. The justification of that franchise has only been the ability to make it stick through the use of force against those who would dissent. It is this franchise which I wish to dispute tonight, and since we will be talking at length about two kinds of dispute resolving mechanisms, those which claim an exclusive franchise, and those which do not, I propose the following terms: FDR, which stands for Franchised Dispute Resolver, and CDR, which stands for Competitive Dispute Resolver. There is only one essential difference between a CDR and an FDR, and that is the CDR does not demand for any reason that you must do business with it. In all other things a CDR could be identical to an FDR, but in practice this one change will result in many improvements. I should repeat that, as it has been pointed out before, Free Isles, if it constructs new land, can properly establish an FDR on that land whose franchise is based on contractual acceptance of the FDR by immigrants. Such an FDR would be the first moral FDR ever initiate. However, with the birth of the first child within the territory of that FDR, the traditional choice would arise again. The FDR can take the position that the child may decide for himself whether he wishes to contract with the FDR or ignore it. If the FDR takes this position, it has become a CDR. Or the FDR may take the position that because the child was born in its territory, he must contract with the FDR. The justification. There is none based on principle, and usually the justification abandons principle for expediency, such as, unless everyone supports us, how can we accomplish our objectives? Lastly, there have been some attempts to mitigate this coercion practiced by FDRs. In place of pay up or go to jail, there has been pay up or get out, and there has been suggested pay up or do without our type of service, and we will prevent you from buying from any of our competitors. Each of these practices, coercion, pay up or go to jail, is essentially your money or your life, or a portion thereof. This is so obviously coercion that it has fallen into disrepute except for those countries that build walls around their borders. Most nations have substituted pay up or get out. Before examining that for coercion, I want to establish a point. The president is an individual human being just like you or I. A soldier or policeman or judge is just like you or I. Those who call themselves government representatives are no different than anyone else. If it's all right for the president to do something to me, then it's right for me to do the same thing to the president. I am trying to dispel that connotation of something a little bit different and special that used to apply to the king, and I'm afraid, still applies to government. Whatever is right or wrong is equally so for all men. Now, if I walk up to you and demand, pay up or get out, your first question would be, is this your house? And if I answered, no, it's your house, but that's what you're going to pay me for, to accept partial ownership of your house, I think you would conclude I was practicing coercion, and if it's coercion for me, it's coercion for Free Isles, or any other FDR. The other version, pay up or do without our type of service, and we will prevent you from buying from any of our competitors. If I announce to you that I will be glad to sell you matches at 50 cents a box, but that you are under no obligation to buy, and that I would shoot you if you bought from one of my competitors, I think you would agree this is coercion. It was coercion when Kruger used it to sell matches, it's coercion when the federal government uses it to sell postal service, and it's still coercion when used to sell the basic dispute resolving service itself. Can an FDR be morally established and maintained? I have not yet heard of a contract set forth which can accomplish this. Nor have I been able to generate such a contract myself. I strongly suspect that there is no moral way in which such an organization could be perpetuated. To summarize this first portion, a CDR is a dispute resolver that asks to serve you, an FDR demands your business. We have two problems to solve: legal plunder, and illegal plunder. Government was established to prevent illegal plunder, and it's simply not doing the job. I'll give you briefly two personal examples to support this contention. In July of 1958, a panel truck was reported stolen to the LA police. In September 1958, I purchased the truck from a used car lot, and the pink slip was sent to Sacramento. In February 1959, it was first listed by the police as a wanted vehicle. It was erroneously listed as a pickup instead of a panel, and for identifying marks they referred to the license plate. Not mentioned was the fact that it was painted gold with blue fenders, or that it was covered on all sides with large signs advertising Lopez TV service. For 5 years the police hunted for this vehicle. During that 5 years I sent in a yearly license renewal, 3 change of addresses on the vehicle registration, and received a citation from an LA City policeman for speeding in the truck. Finally, in March of 1963 I received a phone call from the police asking if I had such a truck. The other instance was a burglary which in effect stole 6 to 12 months of my life. Police patrols to prevent such occurrences were apparently almost non-existent. The policeman sent to investigate was a semi-literate sergeant whose job seemed to be to explain that the job of protecting property is immensely difficult if not impossible, and although they try very hard, don't expect too much. I don't wish to spend my life on a treadmill, generating property for the benefit of thieves, therefore I consider the improvement of property protection from illegal plunderers to be just as important as the elimination of legal plunder. Suppose I were to announce the formation of a new company to manufacture and distribute gasoline. Suppose I were to ask you as a potential customer, what the octane rating of my gasoline should be, and what color the gas stations should be painted, and who should be the vice president in charge of plant maintenance. Suppose I were to expect you and everyone else to become an expert on petroleum engineering, and management, and marketing, and then expected everyone to come to my office periodically, and without compensation, give me expert answers to all my managerial questions. Suppose I were to announce that I was searching for a man of outstanding ability to manage this enterprise and would choose him by summating all of the individual opinions. Would it surprise you if only a few people bothered to give me their opinions, and of those few practically no one attempted to become an expert in these fields? Would it surprise you that men of ability would not work under such a system, but instead mediocre men would be attracted by its lack of individual responsibility? What I propose seems to be shot through with weaknesses, and yet, what I propose is gasoline produced through democratic processes. If democracy is so worthwhile when applied to government, then why is it not advantageous when applied to the production of gasoline? The answer is that the weaknesses of such a mechanism are apparent when contrasted with the superior mechanism which has been in use producing gasoline. Is democracy an inferior mechanism, and if it is, why was it applied to government in the first place? Democracy itself is a wasteful, ineffective device. It was not conceived or promoted as being able to accomplish anything quickly, thoroughly, or properly. It was desired solely as a method of control appropriate to an FDR. A CDR is controlled instead by direct economic dependence on its customers, therefore many of the control devices appropriate to an FDR are not necessary to a CDR. Legal plunder is of course common and obvious and therefore, has generated a great demand for control of government, but, controls on government greatly hamper its ability to provide property protection services. Most people prefer protection against the government at a cost of loss of protection against unorganized thieves, hence the evolution of government away from kings and toward elections, constitutions, juries, and codified law. These are control devices designed to prevent government from doing the wrong thing. This was of course a wise evolution. An FDR without these controls is a terrible thing. However, when considering a CDR society we must re-evaluate the assorted control devices which we have come to consider as necessary adjuncts to an FDR society. This is an instance where emotional evaluation will almost invariably provide the wrong answers. If I suggest that a CDR should not have a jury system, your emotional evaluation would probably be one of doubt and uneasiness, for the knowledge from which you are summating this emotion is based on a lifetime of living and thinking in terms of FDRs. I urge you in evaluating CDRs, and the ramifications inherent in them, not to use emotions as a tool of cognition. I have demonstrated the weaknesses in the democratic process in the gasoline analogy. I'll go into the jury system and codified law a little later. It is my opinion that people will not choose the ineffective protection and expensive inefficiency of a CDR which incorporates the traditional FDR control devices. I think they will choose instead a CDR organized along corporate lines. This more efficient structure is the primary reason for expecting an improvement in the performance of the property protection function. Next, there is by the very nature of a CDR certain actions which it cannot undertake. There are two kinds of actions which an organization or individual can practice in a relationship with you. Actions which you desire, which I will call positive, and actions you do not desire, which I will call negative. For instance, a gas station provides you with gasoline. This is a positive. It also requires you to pay for the gasoline. This is a negative. For a business to succeed, it must maximize the positive to negative ration. The gas station does this by adding additional positives, restrooms, windshield washing, etc., and also tries to eliminate or minimize negatives, defer payment, lower prices, provide broad sweeping driveways for easy entrance, provide convenient hours of operation. It is unthinkable that an enterprise operating in the marketplace could hand you a complex set of regulations such as the vehicle code and demand that you read, memorize, and behave accordingly. This is a negative, and a very strong one. However, FDRs can and do generate many negatives. Since a CDR cannot successfully generate negatives, a CDR society will not contain many negative elements familiar to us today. What are some of the negative elements generated by FDRs? Compulsory building code, compulsory fire, sanitation, and safety code, zoning, regulation of stock exchange, regulation of banking, denial of freedom to coin money, compulsory bookkeeping standards, compulsory business structures, that is defining what a corporation must be and forbidding nay variation. Compulsory marriage contracts, curfews on individuals, forced closing of businesses on election days, on Sundays, or at certain hours. Antitrust vehicle registration, real estate registration, gun registration, licenses to do business, licenses to bear arms, licenses for medicine, dentistry, and pharmacy, patents, copyrights. A CDR that offered one or more of these negatives would lose business to a CDR which offered fewer negatives. It can be argued that a group of individuals could band together to force other individuals to close on Sunday, or to impress their will on others in any of the above ways. This would be a group organizing for coercion, and will be analyzed later. The point I'm making here is that individuals will not voluntarily contract for one of the above negatives if a competing CDR offers him equal positives without the negative. Of course, negatives and positives are not always easy to identify, and there are many problems in the definition of property and justice that are very difficult to analyze. An advantage in a CDR society is the existence of a number of CDR managers. Paid experts competing against each other to reach an ever better definition of property and justice. These same paid experts have another function, that of critics. It is in their own best interest to uncover the mistakes of their competitors and publicize them as a part of their regular advertising campaigns. The last advantage that I will cover now is the elimination of the vehicle for plunder. Hitler did not organize Germany, he merely assumed control of a ready-made collective. Do you think Hitler or Khrushchev could successfully organize a giant corporation? I don't. The same mistakes that result in their failure to protect property would result in failure of any activity attempted in the open market. Such men can and do gain the approval of a disinterested, uninformed majority, and thus gain control of a massive organization of force. This is the only means by which such men can peacefully attain such a position, and therefore the elimination of the vehicle itself will contribute immensely to the elimination of plunder. Now let's explore some of the ramifications of CDRs. If men have freedom to select their means of protection, not all men will choose correctly. Some will contract with an inferior CDR and receive inferior services. Some will choose not to contract for this service and will not be personally adequate to protect themselves. Socialized medicine provides mediocre medical service to all. Capitalism provides superior medical service to almost everyone. Socialized schools provide mediocre education to all. Capitalism provides superior education to almost everyone. Socialized government, and that's exactly what an FDR is, provides mediocre protection for all. Capitalism and that's what a CDR is, offers superior protection to almost everyone. A CDR is an enterprise operating under laissez-faire capitalism. It is not the cornerstone of society, or of an individual's life. It is simply another enterprise performing one of the many necessary services. This overwhelming force that we have always lived with no longer exists in a CDR society. With the removal of the source of coercion, laissez-faire capitalism automatically exists. With the elimination of the state, certain practices peculiar to it are eliminated. There is no such thing as a crime against society. The only crime possible is an attack upon the property of an individual, hence the fiction "The State versus Jones" is not valid. A dispute always involves two or more individuals. We have in this country two legal systems, criminal and civil. Disputes are arbitrarily divided into two classes. Disputes between individuals decided by civil courts and disputes with the state decided in criminal courts. Since all disputes are between individuals, only one system of resolving disputes would be erected. As I have stated before, I consider the definition of property and attainment of justice to be a very difficult job. Like creative art, or the practice of medicine, I consider it to be on the frontier of man's knowledge. I don't believe that an artist can yet operate from a handbook of formulas and tables, nor do I believe a doctor who sought to practice medicine from a handbook with no real personal understanding of his subject would be acceptable. Similarly, it is my evaluation that a dispute resolver must be professional. I believe those who decide to contract with an economy dispute resolver whose representatives are not personally qualified to define property and are equipped instead with a handbook, will find they have made a serious mistake. I believe that CDR managers will be almost universally intelligent, capable men, the best among us and not the worst. Such men will not follow orders blindly. They will, as a requirement of their profession, consider carefully the full implications of their every use of force. There are not special rules for these men. A mistake, that is an act of coercion, is fully punishable by others. The following excuses would no longer be valid: I don't make the laws, I just enforce them. The courts will decide that. That's the court's job. I just operate the gas chamber. What kind of a monster would operate a gas chamber without knowing that what he is doing is right? Men like Adolf Eichmann, and they do exist in this world, and perhaps they will, but in a CDR society they'll have to pay for their mistakes. Because the responsibility for the use of force rests with the man who is to use it. He and he alone can pass final judgment on whether it should be used and how it should be used. Court-type functions will serve to obtain evidence, to ponder the nature of property, and to develop a better understanding of how to attain justice, but the product of the court must then be submitted to the enforcer, who must be the final judge. There is no jury in such a court. A jury is a control device designed to restrict FDRs. FDRs could not be trusted with this power, and so it was turned over to 12 citizens. In practice, a jury is 12 people, none of whom feel particularly responsible and none of whom are working at full mental capacity. A one-man jury would at least generate in that individual from assuming full responsibility for the acts which they collectively perform. If the legislator was required to operate the gas chamber, he'd think a little more deeply before prescribing the death penalty for selling narcotics. If the juror was required to execute his decision, he would think more carefully, and the same applies to the judge. And if all of them were aware that their actions would be reviewed by another court and they would be held to account for their errors, they would think very, very carefully, particularly the man who operates the gas chamber. Because this is an activity which stresses personal responsibility and personal ability, there will be no gigantic corporations. Just as there is no General Motors in the medical profession, there will be none in the protection industry. There will be loose associations, but the members of those associations will refrain from contractual agreements which would require them to use force in a manner they would not individually approve. We come now to codified law. The written code of conduct. Several billion words that each of us has read, memorized, and obeyed every moment of our lives. This is another control device, and the thinking behind it was, that if we just knew that government was going to do, we could bear it, so we'll write down all the things that government can and must do, and forbid it to do anything more. And so the job was started. They've been writing for hundreds of years, and the job is barely started. In truth, the job is impossible. It was started in desperation. In an atmosphere of, but what else can we do? It seemed better to try than to do nothing at all. The object of codified law is to completely eliminate the arbitrary decisions of governmental representatives, but if this end were attained, would you care to live in such a society? If a thief develops a new method of stealing your property, will you be satisfied with an explanation that none had thought of that particular way of doing it, and therefore it's not in the code, and we can't do anything about it, but don't worry, we'll write it into the code right away and we'll catch the next one. If the concept of codified law were ever practiced completely, hordes of thieves would constantly be one step ahead of legislation in exploiting loopholes, by inventing new attacks on property. In addition to being unworkable, codified law is impossible to write. It should not contain such words as enough, sufficient, safe, glaring, glare, plainly, and clearly. These 7 words were all found on one page picked at random from the vehicle code, and some were used several times. Each of these words calls for a judgment and defeats the whole purpose of codified law. If the judge can decide whose headlights are glaring by a formula known only to himself, how has he been restrained? The final overwhelming flaw in codified law is that it is written before the fact. An attempt is made to write a universal answer to all problems before they occur. For instance, a man offers a 6-year-old a lollipop in exchange for 20 years of contracted labor. In anticipating this action, I think we would agree that a law should be written which declares such a contract void, a law which establishes that the government would not enforce the terms of the contract. Now consider the case of a 6-year-old dying of cancer whose life can be saved by $1 million operation, and a doctor is willing to gamble on its success to the extent that he will perform the operation in exchange for 20 years of contracted labor. Such a contract would only be valid if government would honor it, and therefore, in anticipating this occurrence, I think we would agree that the law should allow this type of contract. The first law might state, for instance, that 6-year-olds cannot sign contracts. The second attempt might modify that to healthy 6-year-olds cannot sign contracts, but whatever the wording and no matter how complex and seemingly all-inclusive the law may become, I can propose an additional circumstance which falls on the wrong side of the law. It is relatively easier to examine an occurrence, to discover all of the facts in a particular situation, and then determine where justice lies, than it is to attempt to write all-inclusive answers to all the hypothetical problems that may arise. In a CDR society, an understanding of justice will exist, just as an understanding of good automobile design exists today. There is no force requiring auto manufacturers to build cars like their competition, and different companies in their engineering manuals will express their knowledge in different terms, but now is building Model Ts. If one company should start to produce Model Ts, it would find no market for them. Customers demand that auto manufacturers embody all of the knowledge available on how to build a better product. Similarly, a CDR must comprehend and practice the best procedure yet evolved for obtaining justice, not because a super embodiment of force requires it to do so, but because competition in the marketplace demands that it do so. This body of knowledge will not be expressed in any official language or be printed in any official book. It will probably never be reduced to any one book, for it will always be improving. Any man of ability can add to this knowledge, the only requirement is that he must be right. A CDR will attempt to collect this knowledge. They will not consider it as codified law, however, it will instead be a starting point. All of the careful thought that has been done in the past as a basis from which to make a decision regarding a specific event in the present. There is one more function that a written law serves, that is as an excuse for an action. Statements such as "we had no choice but to pull you in," according to Ordinance 7466, will no longer be acceptable. If a thing is wrong, it's wrong no matter where it is written. In a CDR society, you needn't worry about what is written in complicated volumes of law. You needn't memorize several billion words. Ask yourself the following question: am I damaging anyone? If you can answer no according to your own common sense, then you can feel secure anywhere in a CDR society. If you're not too sure, go to your local profit-making library and rent a book on property. Don't memorize the words, grasp the idea. That's all that's required of a CDR citizen. If a misguided CDR seizes you and accuses you of violating Technicality 7466, your own CDR asks only what is the nature of your trespass. It does not matter to your CDR whether anyone had ever foreseen such a trespass or written a description of it, or prescribed penalties against it or assigned it a number. Your CDR wishes only to know what is its nature, and if it's valid, to see that only proper damages are charged to you, and if it is invalid, to defend you against unjust claims, and collect any valid damages due you for seizure, etc. Consequently, compiling extensive legal codes will be wasted effort. They will be a wasted effort since people will ignore them when they are unjust, and it is highly unlikely that people can be induced to agree contractually to abide by anything as lengthy and arbitrary as the vehicle code. There has been some concern that the establishment of a number of CDRs would somehow place the individual in increased jeopardy of attack. That the present situation where overt force is legal only for the FDR is somehow safer. This is not true. We are presently surrounded by potential aggressors, individuals within this country, individuals and governments outside the country. These potential aggressors are not withholding their attack because we have not contracted with them, but because we are defended. Aggression does not require a legal stamp of approval but arises spontaneously where defense is inadequate. If a number of CDRs replace the one FDR, it will not increase the total number of potential aggressors in the world but will instead further inhibit those already existing by improving the general level of protection. Two general methods of financing a CDR are possible. First would be a pay-as-you-go basis. When someone damages your property, you contract with a dispute resolver to secure justice, either with cash or on credit. This is the system through which most people hire lawyers. The second method would be an insurance operation, in which a CDR would handle all your problems for a fixed monthly rate. I would guess the latter plan would be the more popular one. It has been suggested that a CDR would tend to support the claims of its customers regardless of whether they are just or not. There will always be a small grey area where none is yet sure of where justice lies, but for the purposes of our analysis, let us assume an attack upon property that is obvious. Let us assume that Jones robs a bank. The bank's CDR notifies Jones that he must return the money and pay damages. Jones notifies his CDR that he's been paying for protection for 10 years and now he wants to receive his money's worth. Make these people stop picking on me. What he is demanding is that his CDR become the muscle behind his coercion. There are two avenues a CDR could follow in going along with this demand. They could do it knowingly, that is, they could say to themselves, there's money to be made in coercion and we'll go back into that business, we'll stop protecting property and begin to attack it, we'll cater exclusively to the bank robber trade. They also could do it unknowingly, that is, they could back up their customer simply because he is a customer, and fail to analyze the nature of his act. Both of these avenues lead to destruction of the CDR who takes them. We'll analyze the unknowing first. A peaceful citizen requires very little protection, a bank robber operating openly requires a constant supply of force. The CDR that tries to protect a bank robber will find its total expenses rising sharply. If the CDR is finances on an insurance-type plan, it will have to raise its monthly premium. The bank robber may be getting a bargain in protection, but all of the peaceful customers are receiving no better protection than their neighbors and are paying higher premiums than those charged by CDRs who have not made the mistake of assuming the expense of protecting the bank robber. Just as automobile insurance companies will not issue policies to race car drivers, a CDR will not offer its service to coercers. If the CDR operates on a pay-as-you-go basis, it could charge the bank robber for whatever force is necessary to protect him. The bank robber is then in a position of hiring his thugs through the CDR, which would then be acting solely as an employment agency. I have been ignoring during this analysis the extremely bad publicity that would result from a CDR embracing any of these errors. The bank robber who pays the full cost of force hired from an unwitting CDR is in the same position as he would be if he hired that force from the CDR that knowingly decided to cater to bank robbers. In this case, the question is bank robbing or any other kind of plundering a paying business? Can a thief pay all of the costs required to be a thief and still show a profit? I will show later on that he cannot. That theft as a way of life is not economically viable. I first presented the basic concept that dispute resolvers must earn the voluntary support of individuals. Secondly, I have presented a picture of many of the conditions that I reason will evolve in a CDR society. At this point I am going to describe a specific CDR. When someone suggests free enterprise roads, the question is immediately raised, who is going to operate these roads, and how is he going to do it? Similarly, there is a need for a concrete example of a CDR, but bear in mind that this example is the result of only a few hours of analysis. I would hardly go into any business with such shallow preparation, so my CDR should be considered only as a starting point for the further evaluation of CDR structures. Do not condemn the CDR system for the weakness in my ability to generate a CDR. If my CDR is a bad CDR, the marketplace will quickly remove me from that activity. I will call my CDR the reliable protection company. Most of my customers pay a monthly premiums or a 6-month premium which earns them a discount. In exchange, I have several protection engineers who periodically but at irregular intervals check the homes and businesses of my clients. Since I pay bonuses for discovering stolen property, they are constantly on the lookout in pawn shops, used car lots, etc. In addition, I subscribe to various worldwide organizations which pay fees to me for locating people and property, and through which I can for a fee locate people and property. I read several trade magazines featuring new understandings of justice, and advertising new equipment and techniques as well as supporting services. I offer my customers a free, optional service through which my security representatives inspect their premises and recommend improvements in locks, lighting, and fences where needed. I offer advice on burglar alarms, and for those who wish it, I will install an alarm system with a direct wire to my office. I am happy to send a man out to stamp identifying marks and serial numbers on any piece of property, since this will make my job easier in the event of theft. To those of my customers who earn a high security rating, I offer a discount. It is in my best interest within reasonable economic limits to prevent acts of coercion against my customers. Conversely, it is also in my best interest to keep my customers out of trouble, to encourage them not to coerce others. For this reason, I publish a monthly newspaper in which I attempt to pass along to my customers my basic understanding of justice, and tips on how to avoid damaging the property of others. I of course consider myself responsible for every action I take. What's more important, other CDR managers will hold me responsible for my action. Therefore, I must be very, very cautious with the use of force. I will not bring someone in for questioning, since this is coercion if it proves unjustifiable. I do not arm my protection engineers with lethal weapons except in special instances. In general, hypodermic bullets, with almost instantaneous knockout capabilities, are sufficient to deter coercion, and in the event of a mistake, an attempt can be made to compensate for the resulting damage. A CDR manager stakes his livelihood, his property, and his freedom on every decision. If I am wrong, there are no excuses. I think it is generally the opinion among Preform participants that there are some advantages to a CDR, but the real controversy arises over whether a CDR society is stable or would degenerate in some manner. The answer as to whether or not a CDR is stable lies in the realm of economics. Force is an economic commodity. It's derived from human labor. the man who carries a gun and the men who manufactured the gun. The creation of force and its use can be analyzed by economic principles. First, let's analyze the problem of organizing an enterprise for the purpose of making a profit through theft. The major expense of this organization will be for the generation of force to overcome the defense of its victims. The income of this enterprise will consist of the confiscated wealth of the victims. The profit will be the difference between these two figures. Let's examine the size of these three figures. How much will the coercer have to spend to overcome its victims? The answer is whatever it takes to do the job, probably slightly more than the amount the victim is able or willing to spend on his defense. How much is the victim willing to spend on his defense? The answer is everything he owns. If he succeeds, he may be poor, but he will still be free. The crossover point between profit and loss for the plunder is the 50% point. If the coercer can manage to defeat his victim, when the victim has only managed to spend half his wealth in defense and the coercer manages to seize the other half intact, it is at best a break-even operation for the coercer. Even if they clash and then draw back, such an encounter is a loss for the coercer. He has expended energy and wealth and accomplished nothing and will be discouraged from trying again. The potential victim, however, considers it a victory. He has successfully repelled aggression and will be encouraged to do so again. It has been suggested that competition pertains only to voluntary action. I consider war to be a kind of competition. A competitive measurement of force. The victors in a war, large or small, are necessarily those who are strongest. The producers in this world create the greatest wealth, and since wealth is convertible into force, they can, if necessary, generate the greatest force. In a CDR society, they are allowed to retain control of their force. In an FDR society, control of that force can be turned over to a Hitler by a popular vote. Since I have shown that it is impossible to make a profit by attacking victims for their wealth, it would follow that any coercion, such as jailing atheists, nudists, or homosexual as undesirables, would be even more expensive and self-limiting, since absolutely no income would be derived to defray the expense of the operation. As far as protection being an area-related product, it is somewhat area-related in the watchman function, but otherwise a CDR can service a fairly large area. I have already pointed out that a CDR cannot afford to defend a customer such as a bank robber. For the same reason, a CDR cannot render unjust decisions in favor of a subsidiary company, and thus generate profits. Any deviation from justice becomes an expensive experiment in coercion. This added expense will more than use up the profits acquired by the subsidiary. If the CDR attempts to pass the added expense along to the other customers of the CDR through higher rates or reduced service, it will destroy its competitive position. It has been suggested that a very large CDR could devote just one policeman to coercion and no one would detect the difference in the service or rates of the CDR. This is the same argument that proposes that out of the thousands of General Motors employees, one man could be put to work in a corner somewhere making bolts, and since General Motors would be paying his salary, he could sell his bolts cheaper than anyone else and eventually dominate the bolt industry. This, of course, is not true. To whatever extent the bolt manufacturer was subsidized, the auto manufacturer was sapped. There is no escape from economics. To whatever extent the CDR diverts its resources into the business of attacking property, it diminishes its resources in the business of property protection. The last point I want to cover is the contention that it might work in a moral society but not in an immoral society. If we were living today in a society as moral as that which existed 200 years ago, I don't think I would be worrying about this problem, and looking for improvement. If I lived in that society, I would conclude that it's not perfect, it may not be completely moral, but it's acceptable. Within this framework I can live a productive life. But morality has degenerated, and I find it unacceptable to be forced into a collective with the present population. My desire for an improved system stems directly from the rise of immorality. You've just heard the chapter, Competitive Dispute Resolution, taken from the coming audiobook, The Free Isles Project, an early 1960s exploration into seasteading, alternative dispute resolution, and voluntary governance. Narrated by yours truly, Brian Freer-Robot. To support further productions like this, please consider checking out our full catalog of books, audiobooks, privacy tools, health and wellness items, and more by visiting libertyunderattack.com. While you're there, check out the newest wellness product, handcrafted with love by coordinator Rayo. The Pain Liberator, Miracle Muscle Pain Relief Spray. Again, the website is libertyunderattack.com. Cheers from the Free Republic.